Okay, today we're going to continue talking about branding and we're going to focus mostly on positioning. Now I'm probably going to break down this presentation in two parts. So this is the first part, discussing positioning. Now we were talking about branding in last lecture, right? And one of the absolutely most important aspects of marketing strategy, especially when it comes down to branding, but just marketing strategy in general, is going to be positioning. If you remember when we were discussing strategy overall, I emphasized the fact that the core big picture the core big picture strategy when it comes down to marketing is going to be segmentation, targeting, and positioning, right? Those three are going to dictate the direction in which your four marketing pieces are going to follow, right? So positioning is going to be one of the key aspects of this overarching direction in which the company is going to go to, right? So let's talk about what positioning is first. So let me start by showing you an example that showcases how important brand positioning actually is and what a strong influence it has in all of the purchases that people make in the marketplace. Now, what I'm going to show you here, it's based on some experimental data, some market research conducted by a company, right? And what you can see over here is two different ways of collecting the data. The first way is when you just ask people about their brand preferences, right? So you show them a brand that they are knowledgeable or familiar with. So first you might have to, make sure that you screen out the ones that never heard the brand before, right? Because otherwise whatever the answer is going to be based on guesses, not on their actual perceptions, right? And then you go ahead and ask them about their perception for some brands. This is beer brands, right? So Budweiser, Guinness, Miller Lite, etc., etc. You see them on the screen, right? And what this diagram showcases is how these brands are perceived by the consumers. So in this case, this particular consumer considers Coors and Miller Lite very close to each other, whereas, for example, Miller Lite and Guinness are perceived as being fairly different, right? But it is also true that Coors and Colt 45 are perceived quite differently, right? So this is what happens when people are asked about their brand perceptions. Now, when you take the same people and instead of asking them about their brand perceptions, you give them some beer to taste, right? So in this case, you will give them 6 different taste cups, let's say, right? Or glasses, right? Where they cannot see any of the brands, right? They might not even be able to see the content of the cup because it might be opaque, right? So they don't know, this is just taste, right? And in a situation like this, the same brands that were, perceived as very different or very similar might actually behave quite differently. You can see how in this case, there are 5 brands that are perceived very, very similarly. In fact, I will argue that there's pretty much no difference between these brands, right? And then there's one brand that is perceived quite differently, which is Guinness. Now, if you've ever had a Guinness versus any of the other brands, you know how anybody can tell the difference, right? But it's fascinating that there are, much bigger perceived brand differences if you just ask about the brand than they are if you just give them the taste, right? So, in a lot of these differences that we're observing here, they are basically created because of the positioning that brands have built over time. Okay. So what is positioning then? Positioning is the place that you occupy in the mind of the consumer. Okay. And by you, meaning your brand, right? Your brand, your products, the experiences that you're providing. Okay. And it's absolutely essential for us to understand that perception is going to have 2 components on it. One is going to have objective aspects, right? For example, in the case of beer, right, that Guinness is objectively heavier, more dense, more dark, and maybe the smell is stronger, right? So there are some objective measures that you could actually, use some sort of tool, measurement tool to determine the differences between some of these products. And when I'm talking about beer, you can say the same thing about computers, cell phones, and car insurance. It really doesn't matter, right? Any product, there are in certain aspects where you objectively can ascertain similarity and differences, okay? And we're going to call that objective performance, right? Performance very broadly defined, anything really that customers care about, right? But on the other hand, that perception is also going to be influenced by the messaging of the company, right? So what's going to happen is when a company does a good job at communicating the benefits that their product has, right? You're going to remember that better, and you're going to be more likely to pull that from memory whenever that's asked of you in a survey, like we just did with the previous slide, right? So those perceptions are going to have both objective part and also some subjective part that is going to be a function of the messaging and experiences that people have had in the past with the product. Okay. And it's very important also for us to understand that these levels that I'm talking about, right, like, a product's considered to be luxurious or reliable or high performance, right? This is all relative to some sort of baseline, right? There is no objective zero, right? So because of that, what we're going to do is we're going to have to acknowledge the fact that customers have a frame of reference, some sort of comparison benchmark that they are using to ascertain the different levels of any of the metrics that we're requiring or asking them about. Okay, and they do this quickly and pretty much subconsciously without really having to explicitly think about it, but they are thinking about it, right? So for the most part, this frame of reference is going to be either past experiences that the customer has had with that product category or products that are available in the marketplace, right? So these are not judgments that customers are making in a vacuum. They're just using their existing data, essentially, either from past experiences that they have had in the product category and from current products that can be bought, or maybe some of the messaging that is coming their way from any of the brands in the marketplace. Good. Okay, so let's take an example where we can develop this idea of positioning a little bit further, just to make sure that we go over some details and also so that it's clear what it is that we're talking about. So you can take the car market, for example, right? So car market, you could argue, I will argue, that it has different benefits that are more or less important to different segments in the car market. And so I've divided the entire set of cars in the car market on 6 different attributes that I think are the most important 6 attributes. There are other attributes, of course, but these I will say are probably some of the 6 most important attributes in this space. These are things that customers care about. Okay, so what do I have here? I have the degree of luxury of the car, right? How reliable it is, how safe, value or affordability, performance, broadly defined. This encompasses both 0 to 60 cornering capability, maybe speed, although given the roads, you probably can go really fast unless you can go on the Autobahn in Germany, right? But, performance is essentially completing a task appropriately or, most effectively. So because of that, you could also argue that performance for some segments, it might be in the form of things like gas mileage, right? So it depends how you measure it, all right? Or fuel economy, maybe I should say, given that there are electric cars also involved in the market now. And then you have here style, or how it looks from the outside, right? So I will argue that most segments, most customers that are looking for buying a car are going to care at least about one or probably a mixture of these 6 things, right? So Volvo is a company that has positioned their brand along one main feature or benefit's a better word than feature, which is safety, right? They have a whole host of patents that develop over time, basically things like, reinforcements in the doors in case there is side collision, anti-whiplash, headrests for the car, and on and on and on. They have a huge portfolio of patents that they have been granted based on their R&D they have developed, many of which are around this idea of safety, right? But not only they do this, they also emphasize in their messaging how safe their cars are, right? So they keep reminding their customers about it. So they build safe cars and then they tell customers about it. But what has happened to Volvo over time, right, is that they've realized that this position that they used to hold in the safety space has been diluted a little bit, and it hasn't been diluted because they have done a poor job. It's just other car manufacturers have gotten better at making safer cars, right? Because once that you set the standards for safety, engineers in other car manufacturers have figured out how to make cars safe also, and what has happened is there's a creep up on safety scores, right? So if you look at most segments right now in the United States, almost everybody gets either a 4-star rating or a 5-star rating, right? So when everybody gets 5 stars, you know, safety now suddenly becomes irrelevant, right? So Volvo has realized that they also need to find at least a secondary aspect in which they position themselves, and they've chosen mostly to go for luxury, right? So it's a luxurious car that is very safe, right? Those are that's kind of the positioning that they're trying to achieve in the marketplace. This is how they want you to think about Volvo when you think about Volvo by any chance, right? And the issue with positioning is that it's not all about talking, it also needs to be about action, right? Because people, you know, if you're all talk but, you know, no action, they're just gonna dismiss what you say. So whenever you're talking about luxury and safety, in the case of Volvo, what you need to do is you need to give me reasons to believe that whatever you're claiming in terms of safety and luxury levels are, they're actually backed up by the features that you're building in the cars, right? So the cars actually need to be luxurious for you to believe this. It's not just because you tell me, right? So how do you make the car luxurious? Well, you add things like, you know, multiple adjustable car seats, right? So that you can just really make it comfortable for yourself, or maybe you put a massaging feature on the car's seats, right? So that as you're commuting, you get a nice back rub in your car, right? Or maybe you have a fancy audio system with 16 speakers and an amplifier and, you know, all sort of tech and that, you know, improves your listening experience in the car, right? So these will be features that, you know, unequivocally will indicate to the customer that the car is indeed luxurious. And then you're going to do the same thing with safety, right? So what you're going to do is you're going to build the car in a way that it's safer, right? And so you're going to have specific features in the car that are going to help in case that unfortunately you get involved in an accident, right? So the idea of positioning here is instead of trying to do everything really, really well, which is commendable in terms of wish, but strategically, because you have limited assets, you can only do so much. It's essentially selecting one or maybe two attributes or benefits where you're going to try to excel, stick out from the pack, become the best, and also communicate that to your customers so that when they think about your brand, they think about that benefit that you're trying to provide in that marketplace. So in this case of Volvo, it will be safety and luxury. Right? Now, not all benefits are created equal, okay? And this is something that it's important for us to realize, right? Because if we think about benefits in any product category, you're going to come up with a laundry list of many things that people want, right? But not everything is going to be equally important. And what you're going to find is that there are two very different types of benefits, right? There are benefits that we're going to call points of difference, right? These are things that when you do a very, very good job, people are going to get really excited about it. Right? So when you really stick from the pack and you do a better job on any of these benefits that we're going to call points of difference, and you get people really excited, right? So their satisfaction level shoots up. Okay. On the other hand, points of parity are things that are expected for you to have that having more of you're not necessarily going to get excited about, but if you don't have it, people are going to be upset, right? So this is kind of like the reverse side. These are the things that you're expected to have. And if you don't, people will just remove them, remove those brands from their shopping list. But if you have more of, people are not necessarily going to get extra excited about it, right? So let me show you this graphically. How will this look like? Right? So you have points of differentiation. These are going to be benefits that you provide to the customer that it's going to really impact their satisfaction levels if you do an excellent job at this. Okay. So let's talk about me, right? So right now my daughter is going to turn 16 and I'm already realizing that I'm going to have to get her a car, right? So that she can just start driving around, which let's just say nicely frightens me, right? So because of that, even though when it comes down to me and my own car, maybe I'm less worried about this, but I'm really worried about the crash worthiness of the car that I'm going to buy for my daughter. Right? So in this instance, right, for me, because of the purchase situation, safety, if I find a car that is very, very, very safe, right, that in case of an accident, which I know my daughter is probably going to have, hopefully just a fender bender, but, you never know, and you learn by doing, so, right, maybe in a simulator. So anyway, so because of that safety for me, a car is really safe, I'm going to be really excited. So my satisfaction level, which is what we're measuring here in the y-axis, is going to shoot up if the safety, let's say, if the way I'm executing in the safety space, let's say that we are measuring safety in this diagram on that light blue color that I have under points of differentiation, right? It's going to shoot up. It's going to be something that is really, really impacting my satisfaction level. And it makes it a lot more likely that I will actually buy this product in this case, right? Okay. And then you have the opposite to this. What is the opposite to this? The opposite to this is things that the car needs to have, but that I'm not going to be excited about, right? Like, for example, in the case of a car, let's say that I think the car should have a spare tire. If it doesn't have a spare tire, if it only has a little anti-patch can and a CO2 canisters, but there is no spare tire, then maybe I will be very dissatisfied, right? So not having that feature is going to make me drop my satisfaction level dramatically right here, right? So at low levels of that feature that is a point of parity, something that I think should be there, and I'm just going to really dislike the product, and because of that I'm probably not going to consider it, or if I buy it, I'm going to be really unhappy with it. But having two spare tires, right, in my case, so if it gives you a lot of that benefit, in this case, let's say that they put two spare tires, or they put a spare tire, and on top of the spare tire, they have an anti-patch, like some sort of goopy thing that you can put in the tire in case you get a flat, and a little canister of CO2 so that you can inflate it again. Well, if I have a spare, I don't see much benefit of having that extra way of fixing the car. So because of that, maybe, I don't get really excited about it, right? So it's something that, it's fine if they put it, but it's not something that is going to make me buy the car. But if it doesn't have the spare tire, I might not buy it, right? Because it might be something that is really important for me, although it doesn't get me excited, right? It's something that has to be there, and we call that a point of parity. Okay. And then finally, you have other variables that are linear satisfier. Those are things that don't get me really excited, but the more I get, the better, right? Like, for example, in the case of the car, in my case, because my daughter is not going to be driving around much, maybe fuel consumption, like gas mileage, it's something like that, right? So the more fuel efficient the car is, the better, right? Why not? It's better for the environment, so, plus. On the other hand, right, if it's not very fuel efficient, but it's very safe, right, then maybe, it doesn't really matter that much, right? So the linear satisfiers, like you can see here, they matter, right, but they don't increase dramatically like the points of differentiation do. Okay, so this diagram is very important because you really need to understand that it's not clear a priori how people are going to react to each of the different benefits that you could position yourself around. And it's very crucial, if you can, that you pick something like this, because this is really going to impact the level of satisfaction of people and also the degree of liking towards that product. So because of that, if you hit the nail on the head on something that people really care about, that they get excited about, you're going to make it big. On the other hand, if you do the same thing with something that is considered a point of parity, you're not going to see much of a difference in your sales, right? So really understanding what the response function is to these different benefits that you're positioning yourself around, it's really crucial. And this is not something that you might be able to know right away a priori. So maybe some market research is needed. Good. Now, how do I go about positioning then? What is the process that I'm going to follow? Okay. Well, the first thing you're going to do is acknowledge that this positioning needs to be done for a particular target market. Okay. So you're first going to do your segmentation, and from the segmentation, you're going to decide which segment is the one that you're going to target, the one that you think is most attractive. Whether attractiveness is because you can deliver some extra value for that segment because of your capabilities, or because that segment is either larger or it has more spending power, right? So first select the target market. After you've selected the target market, what you need to do is you need to make sure that you understand very well what the needs are for that segment. What is it that you're trying to fulfill? What kind of vectors of differentiation are possible in this space, right? Okay. So understand, have a clear profile of the benefits that are desired by the target segment, not by everybody, but this particular group of people. Okay. Then you should also look at your competition, right? Because this is going to be important, because it's going to a large degree determine how your product's perceived, right? Because remember, they're going to use your competitors as a frame of reference for your claims, right? Anything that you say, it's going to be compared to the competitor, right? So if you improve, but your competitor improves more, suddenly you're going backwards, right? Good. So make sure that you understand what your competition is up to. Okay. Good. Then after that, what you need to do is you need to try to identify which one of those benefits are you going to try to differentiate yourself against, right? And to do that, you're going to have to take into consideration both the customer input, right? What they care about, and B, what competitors are good at, right? So probably going head on against a competitor in something that they are good at, it's going to be more difficult than selecting some other benefit that customers care about, but maybe the competitor is actually not emphasizing, right? And so it's food for thought, right? But at the end of the day, what matters is what's considered a point of differentiation, or a point of parity by the consumer, and that's hard to judge a priori, right? So you might have to take your chances and decide on a unique position and see how it actually plays out. Then what you're going to do is, after you have that unique position in mind, because you've selected the key benefit or benefits that you're going to be trying to emphasize or excel at, then what you're going to do is build a marketing program around it. Marketing program, remember, is your 4 Ps, right? So you're going to talk about your product, right? So you're going to have to actually build something that supports that positioning. You're going to be talking about the price that is consistent with that positioning. So if you're a luxury product, you cannot be too cheap, because then you're sending equivocal signals in the marketplace, right? And you're also going to have to promote that product. So your messaging is going to have to be on point and consistent with that positioning that you're trying to achieve. And finally, you're going to have to use the right distribution channels to get that product to the final consumer, so you have your place. Okay. And then at the end of the day, you're going to have to continuously feedback here and make sure that whatever it is that you're positioning yourself against has not shifted, either because customers have become less interested in that aspect, or because everybody else has gotten so good at it that customers don't care going beyond that, which happens. Like I give you the example of safety, for example, in the car market. You can see the same thing happen in computers, in cell phones, etc. Okay, good. Now, what about differentiation versus positioning? So when we're talking about strategy, I was saying that differentiation is one of the key strategies that you can genetically follow, right? So by being different than everybody else in the market, you're going to be hopefully surviving in the long term and being profitable. Now, Differentiation and positioning go hand in hand. The differentiation is what you're trying to achieve strategically. Positioning is how you do that in the minds of the consumers, right? So those two concepts actually go together. Now, how can you differentiate yourself? Generically, there are going to be only a couple of options for you to do. One is you can differentiate yourself along product features or product benefits. Okay, so we were talking about safety as being one of the product benefits in the case of Volvo, but you could have picked a different one. Okay, you could have picked performance, like BMW does, for example, right? So BMW is the ultimate driving machine, right? So what you're caring about more than safety, although arguably if you look at crash test, BMWs are usually safe, but you are emphasizing performance, right? So in a situation like that, you're picking one of the benefits and sticking to it, okay, like we did before. The other option that you have generically is going for services that go around the product, okay? So essentially customer support, providing more support for the product. So who does a good job at this in the car market? An interesting brand, and I will talk about this again in repositioning, will be Hyundai, right? Or Kia, which is the sister company of Hyundai, right? And these are cars that now emphasize a lot customer support. So they have a warranty that is at best matched by a few competitors, but I don't think it's overtaken by any of them, right? So I think it's 3 years bumper to bumper and 5 years powertrain or 100,000 miles, right? Which at the time that it was launched, about 15 years ago, it was a breakthrough. Nobody was matching that, and everybody was scratching their heads and wondering how they could actually offer such an extensive warranty, right? So that's a different positioning that you can take. And then finally, you can also work on the image aspect, right? So this is how companies like Apple, for example, sell a lot of their products, right? So if you look at iPhone, for example, a lot of the benefits of the iPhone are similar, if not inferior, at least from a technical standpoint, from those of competitors like Samsung Galaxy, right? But the products sold on this cool tech image, right, that surrounds the brand, that has been built over at least the last 40 years since Steve Jobs launched Apple from their garage, right? So this image that has been built through advertising and also, product design. So it's not just fluff, but there is some marketing behind it, right? Still very effective. And you can see this if you take, for example, a Samsung Galaxy, which is a current competitor to the iPhone. You will see that many times the Samsung Galaxy will be the one that 2 or 3 years before the iPhone uses a lot of the technology is already been in the marketplace and the Samsung Galaxy. Yet the iPhone is going to be still more expensive and sell more units than the Samsung Galaxy because it has this image, right, associated with it. Okay. Now, those are the three broad differentiation strategies, either by looking at the benefits, by looking at customer service, or image, right? On top of that, when it comes down to changing your positioning, there's going to be essentially 3 things that you can do, okay? The first one is trying to double down on what you've done so far, so strengthen the current position. So if, for example, you're trying to, in the case of the car manufacturer, if you're going for luxury, so that will be a brand like Mercedes-Benz, for example, right? Then what you can do is you can, I don't know, for example, bring in new materials to the interior, right? So car company that has done this recently is not Mercedes-Benz, but it's Lexus, right? So for example, in the LS, Lexus LS, instead of using traditional wood, right, wood trim, which you might like or might not like, right? Now, for example, what they have is they have some special clothing that it's folded to look like origami, and also glass, like special glass that is finished like a glass that you will see in some pottery or something like that, right? So it's a different set of materials that are trying to strengthen the current perception that is a very luxurious brand, right? So you're not changing your positioning, you're just doubling down and making sure that you bring something else to the table that's going to put you ahead, hopefully, of your competitors. Okay. Then we have repositioning. This is when you decide strategically that you need a change in direction, right? Whatever you've been doing in the past, whatever you've been trying to achieve in terms of how consumers perceive your brand, you've decided that it needs to change, maybe because consumers have changed, or maybe because your competitors have put you into a position that requires you to move, right? So in a situation like this, you can just reposition the brand. Now, let me say upfront, repositioning is hard, right? Because if you've been telling consumers for 20 years that your brand is about safety, now suddenly talking to them about luxury is kind of like, yeah, I hear what you're saying, but I thought you were telling me before that you were about safe cars, right? In the case of Volvo. So trying to reposition is actually, I will say, oftentimes very difficult endeavor, right? It's something that you need to think twice before you actually start shifting into the direction. This is not a simple thing that just with a few changes and a couple of ads you're going to achieve. Okay. And last but not the least, I would say, is this idea of trying to reposition the competition. Now, if changing your position is hard, one thing that you might be able to achieve that will enable you to be similarly in a new position, but not because you're moving, but because your competitor is moving. And remember, all these judgments that people are making about your brands going to be in a frame of reference of your competitors. So if you can tell a different story about your competitors to your audience, your actual position might shift, right? So you might be able to reposition the competition, right? And this is what is done usually through competitive advertising, right? This is something that, for example, is not legal in a lot of European countries, but it is legal in the US, right? So because of that, I would say some of the funniest commercials are actually competitive ads, right? Like Coke versus Pepsi. I mean, if you're bored one day, go to Google or YouTube, whichever one, and watch some commercials that are Coke versus Pepsi. They're, I think, some of the best. So what you're trying to do is you're trying to convince your your consumers, that your competitors actually not as good as they claim that they are, or that whatever they stand for, it's really different than what they are actually suggesting, right? And by doing that, you're literally moving your own position by having the position or perception of your competitors changing. Now, let me finish by talking about some of the difficulties with positioning, right? What happens when you launch new brands, right? And we were talking about branding, we talked about brand architecture, and a little bit how you can use your old brands to enter new spaces using things like sub-branding. What happens when you go for a brand extensions or a new brand, right? And the idea with a new brand is that you could have more flexibility, right? You can come up with a new position altogether. On the other hand, if you go with a brand extension, right, or a sub-brand, what's going to mean is that your new positioning is going to have to be close to the existing positioning of the parent brand. Okay, so keep that in mind. New brands give you more flexibility. The downside of a new brand, obviously, is that nobody knows anything about it, so brand positioning is a huge endeavor that is going to take a long time, but it can be successful because your positioning can be anything. On the other hand, if you are using a brand extension, right, you have the problem or the difficulty that you cannot depart a lot from the parent brand, so your positioning cannot be very dissimilar from the original brand. On the other hand, it's going to be able to then to be achieved faster, right? Because you are leveraging existing brand assets, right? But you cannot take this too far, right? So when you're doing a brand extension or a line extension, how far is too far, right? So think about a brand like Listerine, which I have here as an example, right? So Listerine, Fresh Breath, Mint, those are the things that come to my mind when I think about Listerine, and also pain in my mouth because it's kind of hard to hold it for a few seconds, right? Okay, so now you tell me you're going to extend that brand to toothpaste. I'm like, okay, well, that makes sense, right? Because it's in the same area, it's used for something similar, and I can see that those mintiness, freshness. Those are benefits that I would like to have in toothpaste. All right, good. But what about Listerine shaving gel? I'm not so clear that I want a shaving gel that kind of hurts a little bit when I put it on and then it makes it really fresh. Those are not benefits that I associate usually with shaving. Yeah, so because of that, line extensions with existing brands, they might be a little bit more limited. You have less flexibility, like I was saying. Okay, and I think this is as far as I want to take it in part one. We'll keep discussing more in part two.